Dominic Corso, the most feared man in Chicago's underworld, didn't pay attention to maids. To him, Clara was just a shadow in a uniform, quiet, efficient, invisible. But when a burner phone slid out of her apron one rainy Tuesday, Dominic saw the terror in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a clumsy employee. It was the look of a woman with a gun to her head. Driven by a gut feeling he couldn't explain, the Don decided to break his own rules and follow her into the night. He expected to find a secret lover or a second job. Instead, what he found in a dilapidated warehouse on the south side froze the blood in his veins and threatened to burn his empire to the ground. You won't believe who she was really meeting. The rain in Chicago didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse on the 45th floor of the Legacy Tower, Dominic Corso watched the city distort through the rivulets of water. At 34, Dominic was the head of the Corso crime family, an organization that had its fingers in everything from unions to high-stakes shipping logistics. He was a man who built his life on knowing everything, every whisper in the mayor's office, every shipment moving through O'Hare, every betrayal before it happened. Yet, he knew absolutely nothing about the woman currently vacuuming his Persian rug, Clara Evans. She had been working for him for 6 months. She was young, perhaps 24 or 25, with chestnut hair always pulled back into a severe fraying bun. Her uniform was always pressed, her demeanor terrified but precise. She spoke only when spoken to, which was rare. Dominic liked it that way. In his world, silence was the most expensive commodity. "Mr. Corso?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Dominic didn't turn around immediately. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, watching the headlights on Michigan Avenue far below. "What is it, Clara?" "I've finished the study and the master suite. Is there anything else you need before I head out?" Dominic turned. She was standing by the heavy oak door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her knuckles were white. She looked pale today, paler than usual. There were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "No, that will be all," Dominic said, his voice a low baritone that usually made grown men flinch. Clara nodded quickly, too quickly. "Thank you, sir. Have a good night." She turned to leave, but as she pivoted, her movement was jerky, uncoordinated. Her hip bumped the edge of the antique side table. A small, cheap object clattered onto the hardwood floor. It wasn't a cleaning tool. It wasn't her personal smartphone, which Dominic knew was an older model iPhone with a cracked screen. It was a black flip phone, a burner. The silence in the room instantly shifted from peaceful to predatory. In Dominic's line of work, a burner phone meant only one thing: business that couldn't be traced. And maids didn't have business that couldn't be traced. Clara gasped, dropping to her knees to scramble for the device. Her movements were frantic, like a soldier diving on a grenade. Dominic didn't move toward her, but his eyes narrowed. "I didn't know you dealt drugs, Clara." She froze, her hand gripping the plastic phone. She looked up, her eyes wide with genuine fear. I don't, sir. It's for my grandmother. She's old-fashioned, doesn't like smartphones." It was a lie. Dominic could smell a lie, like he could smell ozone before a storm. The cadence was wrong, the pitch was too high, and why would she be so terrified of dropping a phone for a grandmother? "Leave it," Dominic said deeply. She stood up, pocketing the phone with a trembling hand. "I'm sorry for the noise. Good night, Mr. Corso." She practically ran out of the apartment. Dominic stood alone in the silence. He finished his bourbon in one swallow. He walked over to the intercom on his desk and pressed the button. "Riley." "Yes, boss?" The voice of his right-hand man crackled through the speaker. "Bring the car around, the black sedan, no driver. I'm driving myself." "You sure, Dom? The weather is hell out there, and the Volkovs are stirring up trouble near the docks." I said, "Bring the car, Riley, and pull up Clara Evans' file. I want to know where she lives, who she talks to, and exactly how much we pay her." "The maid? Did she steal something?" "She's about to steal my patience," Dominic muttered. "Just do it." He grabbed his trench coat and his shoulder holster. He didn't know why he was doing this. He had $1 million shipment arriving at the port at midnight. He had a meeting with the city councilman at 9 a.m. He didn't have time to stalk his cleaning lady, but Dominic Corso survived because he trusted his gut, and his gut was screaming that the terrified girl with the burner phone was the most dangerous thing in his penthouse tonight. Dominic sat in his unmarked Audi, the engine idling silently a block away from the service entrance of the Legacy Tower. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the Chicago streets into rivers of neon reflections. 10 minutes later, Clara emerged. She wasn't wearing a coat suitable for this weather, just a thin beige cardigan over her uniform and a scarf wrapped tight around her head. She didn't head for the bus stop, which would have taken her north to the address on her file, a small studio apartment in Rogers Park. Instead, she walked fast, head down, heading towards the subway station. Dominic eased the car into gear, keeping a safe distance. He watched as she descended the stairs into the station. He cursed under his breath. He couldn't follow her onto the train without being made. A man in a $3,000 suit stands out on the CTA, especially at night. He grabbed his phone. "Riley, track her phone. The real one, not the burner." "On it," Riley replied instantly. "She's pinging at the Grand Station. Looks like she's getting on the red line. Heading south." "South," Dominic repeated. Rogers Park was north. "Keep me posted on her stops. I'll shadow the train line on the surface." Dominic drove aggressively, weaving through the traffic on State Street. The red line headed towards the south side. Englewood, Roseland. These were areas where the Corso family had tenuous truces with local gangs, but it was no place for a woman like Clara to be wandering alone at 8 p.m. on a Friday. "She's moving fast, Dom," Riley's voice came through the car speakers. "She just passed Chinatown. She's not stopping." Dominic sped up, running a red light at Archer Avenue. "Where is she going, Clara?" he whispered to himself. "She's getting off," Riley barked. 47th Street, 47th and the Dan Ryan. Dominic swerved the Audi onto the expressway ramp, pushing the engine. He exited at 47th, the neighborhood instantly changing. The luxury of the loop was gone, replaced by boarded-up windows, flickering streetlights, and the palpable tension of a territory war zone. He spotted her. She was walking along the sidewalk, huddled against the brick wall of a liquor store, trying to stay out of the rain. She checked the burner phone, then looked over her shoulder. Dominic killed his headlights and pulled to the curb 3 blocks back. He watched through the rain-slicked windshield. A car pulled up next to her. It wasn't a taxi or an Uber. It was a beat-up 2005 Chevy Impala with tinted windows and rust around the wheel wells. Clara didn't get in. She leaned into the passenger window. Dominic reached into his glove box and pulled out a pair of compact binoculars. He adjusted the focus. The window of the Impala rolled down. A hand reached out. It wasn't a friendly greeting. The hand grabbed Clara by the scarf, yanking her face down towards the car door. Dominic's jaw tightened. His hand instinctively went to the door handle, but he forced himself to wait. He needed to know the who and the why. Clara didn't fight. She was pleading. He could see her mouth moving rapidly. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick white envelope. Cash. She handed the envelope to the person in the car. The hand released her scarf. The car sped off, spraying her with puddle water. Clara stood there for a moment, shaking, before turning and walking toward a looming, dark structure down the block, the old St. Jude's orphanage. It had been shut down for years, a husk of red brick and broken glass. "Riley," Dominic said, his voice cold as ice. "Run the plates on a rusted silver Impala, partial plate LK4, and tell me who owns the old St. Jude's building on 47th. St. Jude, S? That's abandoned, Dom. City property. But wait, Intel says the localized street crew, the Kings, have been using it as a stash house. They're loosely affiliated with the Petrovic syndicate. Petrovic, the Russians. Dominic's blood ran cold. The Petrovic family was his main rival for the harbor contracts. If his maid was paying off the Russians, she was a mole. She had access to his office, his files, his schedule. Rage, hot and blinding, filled his chest. He had let a spy into his home. He watched Clara slip through a chain-link fence and disappear into the side door of the abandoned orphanage. Dominic checked his weapon, a custom Sig Sauer P-226. He chambered a round. He didn't need backup for a maid and a few low-level thugs. He stepped out of the car, the rain instantly soaking his coat. He moved like a shadow, crossing the street and slipping through the same fence. The building smelled of mold and stale urine. He could hear voices echoing from the second floor. He moved up the stairs, avoiding the debris that would crunch under his boots. He reached the second-floor landing and saw a faint yellow light spilling from a doorway at the end of the hall. He crept closer, pressing his back against the peeling paint of the wall. He listened. "Please," Clara's voice. She was sobbing now. "I gave you the money. That was everything. My entire paycheck. Please, just let me see him." "Not enough, sweetheart," a rough, gravelly voice answered. A man, heavy Russian accent. Interest went up. "You know how it is. The boss, he gets impatient." I can get more," Clara stammered. "Mr. Corso, he leaves cash around sometimes. I can take it." Dominic's grip on his gun tightened. So she was stealing, or planning to. "Corso," the Russian laughed. A cruel, wet sound. "You're close to the wolf, eh? Maybe we stop asking for money. Maybe you bring us something else. A file? A key?" "No!" Clara's voice rose in panic. "I won't do that. I won't betray him like that. He's been kind to me." "Kind?" The sound of a slap echoed through the hallway. Sharp, brutal. Dominic flinched. "He is a killer, stupid girl," the Russian spat. "And so are we. You want to see the boy? You bring us the shipping schedule for next week, or we send the boy to you in pieces." "The boy?" Dominic frowned. He risked a glance around the doorframe. The room was lit by a camping lantern. There were 3 men. 2 were standing by the window, smoking. One, a massive brute with a shaved head, was towering over Clara. She was on the floor, clutching her cheek. But it was what was in the corner of the room that made Dominic freeze. In the corner, chained to a radiator, sat a young boy, maybe 5 years old. He was skinny, dirty, and hugging a ragged teddy bear. He wasn't crying. He looked too exhausted to cry. He just watched Clara with wide, terrified eyes. "Mummy," the boy whispered. Dominic felt the air leave his lungs. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't a mole for the sake of greed. She was a mother being blackmailed, and the Petrovics had her son. The Russian grabbed Clara by the hair, dragging her towards the boy, but stopping her just out of reach. "Look at him. Say goodbye. Next time you come without the schedule, he won't be here." Clara screamed, a sound of pure, primal heartbreak. "No, please, I'll do anything. Just don't hurt Leo." Dominic pulled back behind the wall. His mind raced. He had 2 options. Option 1, walk away. She was a liability. The Petrovics were using her to get to him. The smart play was to fire her, cut ties, and secure his operation. Option 2, kill everyone in that room. Dominic looked at his gun. Then he thought of the fear in Clara's eyes when she dropped that phone. She wasn't terrified of him finding out she was a criminal. She was terrified of failing her son. Dominic Corso was a monster. He knew that. But he was a monster with a code, and nobody touched children in his city. He reached up and adjusted his cufflinks. His face settled into a mask of deadly calm. He stepped into the doorway, his silhouette filling the frame. "I think," Dominic said, his voice booming through the small room, "you gentlemen are asking for a schedule that doesn't belong to you." The 3 Russians spun around, hands going for their waistbands. They were too slow. The room exploded into motion, but Dominic was already a ghost of violence. The first Russian, the one closest to the window, didn't even clear his holster before Dominic's Sig Sauer barked twice. 2 rounds, center mass. The man crumpled like a suit of empty clothes, his cigarette still glowing on the floor. The heavy-set brute holding Clara by the hair roared, using her as a human shield. He fumbled for a snub-nosed revolver. "Drop her!" Dominic commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. He didn't aim for the head. It was too risky with Clara's head so close. Instead, he tracked the man's exposed leg. Crack! The bullet shattered the Russian's kneecap. He shrieked, his grip on Clara's hair loosening as he collapsed. Clara scrambled away on her hands and knees, sobbing as she reached for Leo, the boy in the corner. The third man, a wiry youth with a scar running through his eyebrow, dived behind a heavy wooden desk, blind-firing a MAC-10. The spray of bullets shredded the plaster above Dominic's head. Dominic didn't flinch. He dropped into a crouch, sliding behind a structural pillar. "Clara, get down!" He waited for the rhythmic click, click, click of the MAC-10 running dry. The Russian youth was panicked, his hands shaking as he tried to jam a fresh magazine into the weapon. It was the last mistake he ever made. Dominic stepped out from the pillar and fired a single, precise shot. The youth fell back against the window, the glass shattering as his body slumped through the frame into the rainy night below. Silence reclaimed the room, broken only by the wet gasps of the man with the shattered knee. Dominic walked over to the brute. He didn't look at Clara yet. He looked down at the Russian, who was clutching his leg, blood pooling on the floor. Dominic placed the hot barrel of the Sig Sauer against the man's forehead. "Who ordered the kidnap?" Dominic asked. Go to hell, Corso," the man wheezed, his face twisted in agony. "Petrovich, he knows she works for you. He knows everything." "Not everything," Dominic said. "He didn't know I'd be the one to come for the collection." He pulled the trigger. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Dominic holstered his weapon and turned. Clara was huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around Leo. The boy was buried in her chest, his small hands clutching her cardigan. She was shaking so violently that her teeth were chattering. She looked up at Dominic, her eyes filled with a new kind of terror. To her, he wasn't the savior. He was the man who had just executed 3 people in front of her child. "Get up," Dominic said, his tone softening only slightly. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't tell them anything, Dominic. I swear. They took him from the park 2 weeks ago. They said if I didn't give them the logs from your study, they'd send me his fingers." Dominic looked at the boy. Leo was staring at him, not with fear, but with a strange, wide-eyed curiosity. "Is he the grandmother who likes flip phones?" Dominic asked. Clara looked down, ashamed. The phone. It was the only way they'd let me hear his voice, once a day, for 30 seconds. Dominic felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pity. Pity was for the weak. It was respect. This woman had walked into the lion's den every single day, cleaned his floors, and looked him in the eye, all while carrying the weight of a kidnapped child. "Can you walk?" he asked. I think so." "Then move. We have 5 minutes before the Kings realize their stash house has gone quiet." The drive back toward the north side was silent. Leo had fallen asleep in the back seat of the Audi, his head resting in Clara's lap. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her hollow and grey. Dominic drove with one hand on the wheel, the other tapping rhythmically on the gear shift. He wasn't heading back to the penthouse. The penthouse was compromised. If the Russians knew she worked for him, they knew where he lived. He pulled into the underground garage of a nondescript brownstone in Lincoln Park. It was a property owned by a shell company, one of the few places even Riley didn't visit often. "Inside," Dominic ordered. He led them up a private elevator. The apartment was cold, covered in dust sheets. He flipped a switch, and the recessed lighting warmed the room. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a leather sofa. Clara sat, still holding Leo as if he might evaporate. Dominic went to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water. He brought them over, handing one to her. Her hands were still trembling so much, the water splashed over the rim. "Talk," Dominic said, pulling up a chair opposite her. "From the beginning. Why you? Out of all the people in Chicago, why did they pick my maid?" Clara took a shuddering breath. "My husband, his name was Thomas Brennan." Dominic's eyes sharpened. "Brennan? The accountant for the dock workers' union?" "Yes," she whispered. He saw something he shouldn't have. He saw a manifest for a shipment that didn't exist. He realized the Russians were using the union to smuggle something more than just untaxed cigarettes. He tried to go to the police. Dominic leaned back. He remembered Thomas Brennan. The man had disappeared 18 months ago. The word on the street was that he'd skipped town with union funds. "They killed him, didn't they?" Dominic asked. "They made me watch," Clara said, her voice dead. "And then they told me that if I ever spoke, Leo would be next. They forced me to take the job at your place. They knew your previous maid was retiring. They handled the paperwork, the background check. They have people everywhere, Dominic." "So you were a plant," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "I was a prisoner," she snapped, a flash of fire finally returning to her eyes. "I didn't want to be there. I hated every second of looking at you, knowing what kind of world you live in. But I had to save my son." Dominic looked at her. Really looked at her. She wasn't just a maid. She was the widow of a man who had tried to do the right thing, and she was a mother who had survived a year of psychological torture. "The money you gave them tonight," Dominic said. "Where did it come from? I don't pay you that much." Clara looked away. "I sold my wedding ring, and I took some of the silver coins from your display case last month. I'm sorry. I'll pay it back." Dominic waved a hand dismissively. "The coins are nothing, but the Petrovics, they don't just want shipping schedules, Clara. If they're using the union, they're trying to bypass my security at the port. If they get a foothold there, they can move enough fentanyl to drown the Midwest." Suddenly Leo stirred. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. He looked at Dominic, then at the gun holster still visible under Dominic's coat. "Are you a policeman?" the boy asked sleepily. Dominic looked at the child. He thought of his own father, a man who had handed him a pistol at the age of 12 and told him that love was a liability. "No, kid," Dominic said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm the guy who makes the monsters go away." Leo nodded, seemingly satisfied, and drifted back to sleep. Dominic stood up and walked to the window. "They're going to come for you. Now that their men are dead, they'll realize I have you. You can't go back to your apartment." "What am I supposed to do?" Clara asked, desperation leaking back into her voice. "I have no money, no home, and the most dangerous men in the city want us dead." Dominic turned around. He looked at her, the bruise on her cheek, the fierce way she held her son. "You're going to stay here," Dominic said, "and you're going to help me." "Help you? How?" "You said your husband saw a manifest. You said he knew what they were smuggling. He must have kept records. A man like Thomas Brennan wouldn't go to the police without proof." Clara hesitated. He had a key to a safety deposit box at First National. He told me if anything happened, it was my insurance policy. But I was too scared to go. I thought they were watching the bank." Dominic felt a grim smile touch his lips. They probably were. But they won't be watching me. He pulled out his phone and dialed Riley. "Change of plans," Dominic said. "Forget the harbor shipment. I want a full tactical team at the First National on Clark Street at dawn. And Riley, find out everything you can about a man named Viktor Petrovich. It's time we ended the Russian winter in Chicago." He hung up and looked at Clara. "Tomorrow we get your life back," Dominic said. "But tonight, you sleep. There's a bolt on the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." As he turned to leave, Clara called out, "Dominic?" He paused at the door. "Yes?" "Why are you doing this? You could have just killed them and left us there." It would have been easier. That you hung. Dominic looked at the small boy on the sofa, then back at the woman who had risked everything. Because, Dominic said quietly, I'm tired of being the only monster in the room. Morning in Chicago broke with a deceptively innocent grey light. The storm had passed, leaving the streets slick and smelling of wet asphalt. Dominic drove a different car this time, a nondescript grey Ford sedan he kept for low-profile errands. Clara sat in the passenger seat, wearing a fresh, oversized coat Dominic had pulled from a storage closet in the safe house. It had belonged to his sister, who moved to Italy years ago to escape the life. It fit Clara loosely, making her look even more fragile. But her eyes were different now. The terror had calcified into a cold determination. Leo was safe, left under the watchful eye of Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who lived in the safe house building and had nursed half the gunshot wounds in the Corso family over the last 30 years. First National opens in 10 minutes, Dominic said, checking his watch. You have the key? Clara unclenched her fist, revealing a small brass key with a faded blue tag. I never let it out of my sight, even when they were beating me. Good. We go in, we get the box, we walk out. Riley has a team on the perimeter, but inside we're civilians. No guns. Clara looked at him, surprised. You're going unarmed? Banks have metal detectors and armed guards, Clara. I'm not robbing the place. I'm making a withdrawal. If I walk in there with a piece, the alarm trips, and the police swarm us before we open the box. We rely on speed. They parked a block away. As they walked towards the heavy revolving doors of the bank, Dominic felt the familiar prickle on the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched. He scanned the rooftops and the parked cars. Nothing obvious. But in his world, the obvious threats weren't the ones that killed you. Inside, the bank was quiet, marble floors echoing the clicks of their shoes. The smell of old paper and sanitizer hung in the air. Clara led the way to the safety deposit viewing room. The clerk, a bored-looking man in his 50s, took the key and Dominic's falsified authorization form. Minutes later, a long, slender metal box was placed on the table in the private viewing room. Clara's hands shook as she reached for the lid. She lifted it. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry, just a single leather-bound notebook and a USB drive. Thomas was old school, Clara whispered, touching the notebook. He wrote everything down. Dominic took the book. He flipped through the pages. It was a ledger. Dates, container numbers, weights, and payments. But it was the column on the far right that stopped Dominic's heart. Authorized by VR. VR, Dominic muttered. He flipped back a few months. VR again, and again. Do you know who that is? Clara asked, reading his expression. Dominic's face darkened, a storm cloud passing over his features. Vincent Ricci. Who? My capo of shipping. The man I trust to watch the waterfront. Dominic slammed the book shut. Ricci has been letting the Petrovics bring in shipments under my nose. He's the one who authorized the containers your husband found. He sold me out. It made perfect sense. How did the Russians know Clara was working for him? How did they know his schedule? Ricci handled the payroll for the household staff. Ricci knew everything. We have to go, Dominic said, grabbing the USB drive and pocketing the book. If Ricci is the leak, then he knows we're here. He knows I pulled your file. They exited the viewing room fast. Dominic grabbed Clara's elbow, steering her toward the exit. Don't look left or right, just walk. They pushed through the revolving doors into the cool morning air. Mr. Corso. The voice came from across the street. Dominic didn't turn. He shoved Clara behind a concrete planter, just as the street erupted. Automatic gunfire shredded the glass facade of the bank lobby they had just exited. Civilians screamed, dropping to the pavement. Stay down! Dominic roared over the noise. 3 SUVs had screeched to a halt in the middle of Clark Street. Men in tactical gear, not police, definitely not police, were advancing, firing controlled bursts. Dominic cursed. He was unarmed. Riley, he yelled into his lapel mic, hoping the comms were still live. "We're pinned! North exit!" "I see 'em, boss," Riley's voice crackled. "Coming in hot." A black van tore around the corner, mounting the sidewalk and ploughing into the lead SUV. The side door slid open, and Riley leaned out with an AR-15, laying down suppressive fire. "Get in!" Riley screamed. Dominic grabbed Clara. "Run!" They sprinted across the 10 yards of open pavement. Bullets sparked off the concrete around their feet. Dominic felt a tug on his coat sleeve, a bullet passing through the fabric. But he didn't stop. He threw Clara into the van and dove in after her. "Go! Go! Go!" Dominic yelled. The van peeled out, tires smoking, as Riley traded fire with the pursuing mercenaries. Dominic scrambled to the front, grabbing a spare Glock from the dashboard. "It's Richie," Dominic growled, checking the magazine. "Richie is the rat." Riley's eyes went wide in the rearview mirror. "Vinny? No way. I've known him since prep school." "The ledger doesn't lie," Dominic said, his voice lethal. "He's been working with Petrovich for 2 years. He killed Clara's husband. And now he's trying to kill us." Dominic looked back at Clara. She was huddled on the floor of the van, clutching the notebook to her chest. She wasn't screaming anymore. She looked furious. "Take us to the docks," Dominic ordered. "The docks?" Riley asked. "That's Richie's turf. It's a suicide mission." "Exactly." Dominic racked the slide of the Glock. "He's expecting us to run, to hide. Instead, we're going to walk right into his office and burn it down." The port of Chicago was a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers, towering cranes and grey water. It was an empire of steel and silence. Dominic's van rolled through the security gate. The guard, recognizing the vehicle, waved them through, unaware that the hierarchy of his world had just crumbled. "Park here," Dominic said, pointing to the shadow of a massive crane. "Riley, you take the east perimeter. If anyone tries to leave the main office, drop them." "What about you?" "I'm going in the front door." Dominic looked at Clara. "You stay here. Keep your head down." "No," Clara said. Her voice was steady. Dominic paused, his hand on the door handle. "Excuse me?" "He killed my husband," Clara said, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "I'm not sitting in the van while you handle my justice. I have the ledger. I'm the witness. If you go in there without me, he'll just say I'm a liar." Dominic stared at her. In the last 24 hours, the timid maid who apologized for existing had vanished. In her place was a woman forged in iron. "Stay behind me," Dominic said. "If I say duck, you drop. If I say run, you run." She nodded. They walked across the gravel lot towards the main office, a corrugated metal structure overlooking the water. Dominic didn't draw his weapon yet. He walked with the confident stride of a king returning to his castle. He kicked the door open. Vincent Ritchie was sitting behind his desk, counting stacks of cash. Viktor Petrovich sat opposite him, smoking a thin cigar. 4 guards stood around the room. The room froze. "Dom," Ritchie said, his smile faltering only for a fraction of a second. "I wasn't expecting you until the shipment tonight." "I bet you weren't," Dominic said, walking further into the room. Clara stepped in behind him, clutching the ledger. Petrovich laughed, a low rumble. "And you brought the cleaning lady. How domestic." "She's not the cleaning lady," Dominic said softly. "She's the executioner." Ritchie stood up slowly. "Dom, look. Whatever she told you—" "She didn't tell me anything, Vinny," Dominic interrupted. "Thomas Brennan told me." He nodded to Clara. She slammed the ledger onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. "Page 42, Clara said, her voice ringing clear in the room. "November 14th, the day you authorized a container of weapons from Belarus, the day my husband asked you about it, the day you ordered him killed." Ritchie's face went pale. He looked at Petrovich. "You said you handled the husband," Petrovich snarled at Ritchie. "You said there was no paper trail." "There wasn't," Ritchie stammered. "I burned the files." "Not his personal files," Dominic said. "You got sloppy, Vinny. You got greedy." Dominic's hand moved. It was a blur. He drew the Glock and fired a single shot into the ceiling. "Everyone out!" Dominic roared. "My beef is with Ricci and the Russian. Anyone else who wants to die for a rat can stay." The 4 guards looked at each other. They were hired muscle, loyal to the paycheck, not the man. They saw the look in Dominic Corso's eyes, the look of the devil himself, and they made the smart choice. They lowered their weapons and backed out of the room. Now it was 3 against 2. "You think you can take us both, Corso?" Petrovich stood up, reaching for a shotgun leaned against his chair. "I don't think," Dominic said. The room erupted. Dominic dove to the right, tackling Clara behind a filing cabinet, as Petrovich's shotgun blasted a hole in the space where they had been standing. "Stay down!" Dominic yelled. He popped up, firing 2 rounds at Petrovich. One hit the Russian in the shoulder, spinning him around. Ricci, panicked, pulled a revolver from his desk drawer and started firing blindly. "You ruined everything, Dom. We could have run this city." "I already run this city," Dominic shouted back, "and I don't sell children to do it." Dominic flanked the desk. Petrovich was struggling to rack the shotgun with one good arm. Dominic didn't hesitate. He put a bullet in Petrovich's leg, dropping him to the floor. Ricci lunged over the desk, aiming his revolver at Dominic's exposed back. Bang! The shot didn't come from Dominic, and it didn't come from Ricci. Ricci froze, a look of shock on his face. He looked down at his chest, where a blossom of red was spreading. He looked up, past Dominic. Clara was standing there. She was holding the gun Dominic had dropped when he tackled her. Her hands were shaking violently, but her aim had been true. Ricci collapsed onto the desk, scattering the money he had betrayed his brother for. Dominic looked at Clara. She dropped the gun, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. She had crossed the line. She had taken a life. Dominic walked over to her. He didn't say a word. He just pulled her into his chest, shielding her eyes from the carnage. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's done." Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance. Riley burst through the door. "Police are 10 minutes out, Dom. We gotta vanish." Dominic looked at Petrovich, who was groaning on the floor. "Riley, tie a bow on Mr. Petrovich. Leave the ledger on the desk. Let the cops find the Russian mob boss with the evidence of his crimes and the body of the traitor." "And us?" Riley asked. Dominic looked at Clara. "We were never here." 3 months later. The air in New York City was different from Chicago. In Chicago, the wind carried the heavy, metallic scent of the ironworks and the damp chill of the lake, a constant reminder of the grit required to survive. But here, in the heart of Central Park, the autumn breeze smelled of roasted chestnuts, dried leaves, and old money. It was a softer world, or at least it pretended to be. Dominic Corso sat on a wrought-iron park bench, his dark wool coat collared against the nip in the air. To the casual observer, he was just another wealthy businessman taking a midday break, handsome, sharp-jawed, reading the Wall Street Journal with casual disinterest. But Dominic wasn't reading the stocks. He was scanning the crime blotter on page 6, though he already knew the story by heart. The headline was modest. Buried beneath political scandals, federal indictment decapitates Russian syndicate in Midwest. It was the final ripple of the stone he had thrown 3 months ago. The article detailed the anonymous tip, courtesy of a ledger left on a blood-soaked desk, that had led the FBI to the Petrovich organization's offshore accounts. It mentioned the discovery of Vincent Ricci's body, ruled a gangland execution by persons unknown. The port was clean. The Corso family's main rivals were either in federal prison or in the ground. Dominic had won. He had consolidated power in a way his father only ever dreamed of. By all accounts, he should be in Chicago, sitting in the Legacy Tower, drinking his celebratory bourbon. Instead, he was watching a 5-year-old boy chase a golden retriever through a pile of maple leaves. Leo looked nothing like the pale, terrified ghost Dominic had found, chained to a radiator in that South Side orphanage. The dark circles that had haunted the boy's eyes were gone, replaced by the bright, vibrant flush of childhood. He was wearing a puffy blue jacket and laughing, a sound so pure and unburdened it seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the city traffic. "He calls him Barnaby," a voice said, soft but undeniable. Dominic didn't jump. He didn't reach for the gun that for the first time in a decade he wasn't wearing. He simply folded the newspaper and placed it on the bench beside him. He looked up. Clara Evans was standing 10 feet away, framed by the canopy of golden oak trees. If Leo had changed, Clara had transformed. The woman who stood before him bore no resemblance to the maid who used to scurry out of rooms to avoid his gaze. The fraying uniform and the tight, severe bun were gone. Her chestnut hair was loose now, cascading over her shoulders in soft waves that caught the afternoon sunlight. She wore a tailored camel trench coat that cinched at the waist, dark denim, and leather boots that added an inch to her height. But it wasn't the clothes. It was the way she stood. She wasn't shrinking anymore. She occupied the space around her with a quiet, regal confidence. She looked like a woman who had walked through hell and come out holding the devil's leash. "Barnaby," Dominic repeated, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. A serious name for a dog that trips over its own paws. "He's a puppy, Dominic. Give him time," Clara said, a playful lilt in her voice. She walked over and sat next to him on the bench. She didn't sit at the far edge, but close enough that the wool of her coat brushed against his arm. "I had Riley vet the breeder," Dominic said, his eyes drifting back to the boy and the dog. "Third-generation pedigree. No history of hip dysplasia. Temperament tested." Clara laughed, a warm sound that made Dominic's chest ache in a way he wasn't used to. "Of course you did. I bet you ran a background check on the pigeons in the park, too, just to make sure they weren't wearing wires." "You can never be too careful," Dominic murmured, though the hardness in his voice was feigned. "Old habits." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the leaves swirl around Leo's feet. It was a comfortable silence, but heavy with the things that hadn't been said in the weeks since he had sent them here. "I received the paperwork from the bank this morning," Clara said quietly. Dominic nodded, his expression tightening. This was the part he had rehearsed. This was the part where he did the right thing. "It's all in order," he said, his voice shifting into a business-like cadence. "The trust fund for Leo is irrevocable. It covers private school, university, and enough of a stipend that he'll never have to worry about rent. The apartment on Fifth Avenue is under a blind trust in your name. The deed is clear." He paused, forcing himself to look at her. "You'll never have to work again, Clara. You can paint, you can travel, you can do whatever it was you dreamed of doing before you met Thomas Brennan. You're free." Clara looked at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. She didn't look grateful. She looked almost disappointed. "You're trying to pay me off, Dominic," she stated flatly. "I'm trying to give you the life you deserve," he corrected, his voice rough. "The life I stole from you by bringing my war to your doorstep. You and the boy. You're safe now. The Russians are gone. Richie is gone. There's no one looking for you. You can disappear into this city. Find a nice, boring man who works in finance. Someone who comes home at 5 p.m. and doesn't know how to clean blood out of upholstery." He looked away, staring at his hands. "You need normal, Clara." Clara shifted on the bench, turning her body fully toward him. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, contrasting with the cold autumn air. Dominic flinched slightly at the contact, unused to a touch that wasn't violent or transactional, but he didn't pull away. "I tried normal, Dominic," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I had normal with Thomas. He was an accountant, he was kind, and he was safe, and he followed the rules. And because he followed the rules, he's dead." Dominic's jaw tightened. That was my world bleeding into his. "No," Clara interrupted. "That is the world, period. It's wolves and sheep, Dominic. I spent my whole life being a sheep. thinking that if I kept my head down, the wolves wouldn't see me. I was wrong. She squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. I don't want a normal life. I lived in fear for 2 years. Every time a car backfired, every time the phone rang, I thought it was the end. I was helpless. She leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto his. I have never felt safer than I did that night in the orphanage. When you walked through that door, you didn't just save us. You showed me that the only way to be truly safe is to be the one holding the power. Dominic looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. It was the same fire he had seen when she shot Vincent Ricci. She hadn't broken under the pressure of his lifestyle. She had been forged by it. I am not a good man, Clara, Dominic warned, his voice low and dangerous. Don't romanticize this. I am still the boss. I still have enemies. There will always be another Petrovich, another rival, another war. If you stay near me, you will always be a target. I know, she said, unflinching. I'm not asking for a fairy tale. I know who you are. I know what you do. Then why? Dominic asked, the vulnerability cracking through his armor. Why choose this? Why choose me? Clara smiled, a slow, secret smile that seemed to stop the world around them. Because you need someone to watch your back, she whispered. Riley is good, but he's an employee. You need someone who isn't on the payroll. You need someone who knows the man, not just the myth. Dominic chuckled, a rare, genuine sound that rumbled deep in his chest. It felt like a weightlifting, a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying until this very moment. Are you asking for a job, Miss Evans? No, Clara said. She leaned in, closing the distance between them until their foreheads were almost touching. I'm telling you that I'm not going anywhere. I don't want to be your maid. I don't want to be your charity case. What do you want? I want a partnership, she breathed. She closed the gap, pressing her lips to his. It wasn't the tentative kiss of a burgeoning romance. It was a seal, a contract written in breath and heartbeat. It tasted of autumn and promise. For a moment, the sounds of New York, the distant sirens, the chatter of tourists, the rustle of leaves, faded into a dull hum. There was only her. Dominic Corso, the man who feared nothing and trusted no one, felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close, anchoring her to him. He had spent his entire life building an empire of fear, constructing high walls to keep the world out. But holding Clara, hearing the laughter of the boy he had saved, he realized he had been building the wrong things. He had built a kingdom of stone. She was offering him a home. They broke the kiss but didn't pull apart. Dominic rested his forehead against hers. A partnership, he repeated, testing the word. It sounded dangerous. It sounded perfect. You know, the hours are terrible, and the retirement plan is non-existent. I think I can handle the management, Clara whispered. Dominic looked past her, toward Leo, who had finally caught the golden retriever and was currently buried under a wriggling mass of fur and tongue. The boy looked up, saw Dominic and his mother, and waved. A happy, frantic wave. Dominic waved back. Deal, Dominic whispered. He didn't check the perimeter. He didn't scan the rooftops for snipers. He didn't look for the exits. For the first time in his life, Dominic Corso just sat back, held the woman he loved, and watched the golden leaves fall over the new dynasty he had truly just begun to build. And that is the story of how a simple act of curiosity brought down an empire and built a new one. Dominic Corso went looking for a spy and found the only person in the world brave enough to stand by his side. It proves that sometimes the strongest people aren't the ones holding the guns. They're the ones with everything to lose. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, redemption, and mafia justice, please shatter that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. I post new dramas every week. What would you have done if you were Clara? Would you have pulled the trigger? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.